After America's victory in Japan, the Second World War was finally over. The American troops would come home to their wives and live in peace. But there was an incredible feeling of shock as the American troops would come home. They were celebrated as heroes, sure, but the praise that they would hear would be intertwined with a nationalist fervor. There was no talk of how they spread democracy and protected the rights of every man and woman to be free in the world. Instead, the praise that they would hear would be one that would encourage them eagerly to take the plunge into hell once again. The America of this timeline is completely antithetical to our history. After Dewey had signed peace with the Europeans, the pro-war Democrats were outraged. The general strike had ceased, but not without extreme punishment. After the socialists called for the strike to cease, the communists had persisted. With the labor movement divided, the federal government suppressed the strike and branded the CPUSA as treasonous traitors, with Earl Browder facing the death penalty. After the end of the strike, American industry was once again war-capable and proved to be vital for securing victory in the Pacific. But America has blood on its hands. In its struggle to secure itself from foreign invaders, it has tainted its character by consorting with fascists. This taint would grow, giving the fascist sympathizers in America legitimacy, instead of discrediting them. Companies who in our timeline traded with the enemy were only supporting their allies. This taint would grow and fester into an infection as the far right in America rallied under Charles Lindbergh, who no longer attempted to hide his fascistic sympathies. 2 years after the war ended, 1948, Lindbergh utterly destroyed Dewey in the elections, gaining a major majority in Congress and the Senate. And in the next 4 years, Lindbergh would slowly cement his rule and implement his vision for America as the light of liberty begins to flicker away. After the League of Nations had failed to preserve peace, the Saxon Allies were attempting to reform the League to be more influential. Just after the war had ended in the Pacific, Dewey had done his best within the last year of his term to attempt to preserve peace in the world. He would invite the Saxon Allies to found a United Nations together, with the goal of allowing each nation of the world to settle their disputes through international law. This would manage to succeed. However, after Dewey would leave office and Lindbergh would take charge, the United Nations was mostly neglected by the Americans. However, they would remain within the United Nations as not to alarm the nations of the world and ruin their diplomatic position. While Dewey was attempting to establish a detente of the Saxon Allies, Lindbergh would flare up tensions as he expanded the scope of their collaboration with their allies in Europe. While America had joined the Latin Axis, the true scope of the alliance had far exceeded its original intention. The previously European-centric alliance was now completely subjugated to the United States of America, and their previous fixation on far-right ideologies was now, at least on paper, no longer a concern for the alliance. Thus, the Latin Axis would reform into the Central Atlantic Treaty Organization, CATO. All previous members of the Latin Axis would join CATO as they sought to expand their alliance, hoping that the new name and fundamentals would help appeal to more prospective nations. America's allies of Europe, the formerly fascist dictators of the Latin Axis, were stuck in a strange state of limbo. In many ways, they had been humiliated utterly. Their nation's borders had been maliciously malformed to suit the whims of foreign nations. But in other ways, they have gained greatly. With the advent of the war ending, reconstruction efforts began, heavily supported by American capital. These flimsy nations would begin to stabilize and recover, uniting with one another economically. The European members of CATO would begin to cooperate their economies as equal partners, laying the foundations for what would be known as the Latin Union, an economic union between the former members of the Latin Axis. The Italians under Grandi would, as promised, revoke the Acerba laws. The first free elections of Italy would occur soon after the war had ended, and resulted in an Italian fascist party victory. The remaining political parties would assert their desires of less governmental interference in the economy, but would not provide any meaningful resistance. In truth, the democracy of Italy was a farce. Nothing had changed. This would begin the struggle for true democracy in Italy, as the Saxon Allies would support any anti-monarchist movements with the goal of removing royal influence before potentially uniting Italy. However, this would be far beyond the horizon, as the Italians had begun an economic boom thanks to American investments, significantly affecting any destabilization attempts by the Saxon Allies. The Vichy France regime, which we will now be referring to as Southern France, would be the most destitute member of Cato. With constant warfare along the entire countryside, the only truly preserved city was Marseille, which would become its new capital. Villeroy's party of this townland became the dominant party in the mainland, much like the Italians had, providing them some stability. However, it would take a long time for France to truly be relevant in geopolitics on both sides of the dividing line. The Iberian Commonwealth became America's playground. With America already controlling the Atlantic islands and Gibraltar, historically Iberian land, these annexations would be justified as a way to ensure America's continued protection of the European allies. Even Malta would become an American territory. The popular support of the Iberian Commonwealth was incredibly small, as American troops operated their garrisons and American capital would prop up the young state. Controversially, the Saxon Allies would fund far-right movements in Iberia in an attempt to weaken the Americans and their presence in the Mediterranean. The Irish situation was much like the Iberian one. However, the Irish would have far more experience dealing with foreign occupiers. The Saxon Allies would support the Irish Republican Army, but also support Northern Irish paramilitaries, who would fight against both the American puppet government and the IRA. The Saxon Allies would attempt to keep the peace between these two insurgents, while the Americans would attempt to sow dissent wherever possible, as to divide and truly conquer the island for themselves. After the Second World War, the Saxon Allies were an extreme zenith of prosperity. With the scientific breakthrough of the nuclear bomb, Germany had begun harnessing the power of the atom for energy purposes and began spreading this newfound prosperity to its allied nations. The Free French, now to be referred to as Northern France, and the German Republic would perform a plebiscite in Alsace-Lorraine, splitting the province along ethno-linguistic lines. The British would face a political shift radically towards social democracy, as the legacy of the Conservative Party would be forever tarnished by those who were pro- and anti-Churchill, as Churchill was not able to reclaim the empire and the last remaining conservatives had nearly doomed British democracy. Thus began the era of Labour dominance, where the United Kingdom would slowly decolonize and shift to a pro-German policy. Due to so many things going Germany's way, there was a period of complacency within the Saxon Allies, as they had faith that the Americans would participate in a status quo scenario as previously pitched by Dewey. However, the Americans had successfully deployed their first nuke and Lindbergh had come to power. The Saxon Allies had to react. In response to the founding of the Latin Union, Germany and her close allies would pursue a pan-European union for themselves. This European Union would have a parliament established in Cologne, rather than Brussels like in our history. The grandfather of Europe, Charlemagne, had groomed Cologne to be the center of the Frankish Empire. It was only fitting that Cologne be selected, for historical and symbolic reasons, to be the center of the European Union, as now there would be no debate as to who was their leader. After the founding of the European Union, many of the states of the Saxon Allies had joined. However, the founding of the European Union had solidified the destruction of the alliance. The Mede de Morse, also known as the Intermarium, and Romania would refuse to join the EU and began to distance themselves from Germany by leaving the Saxon Allies. The Polish feared that Germany would dominate them economically if they had joined, and they wished to assert their independence. This sentiment was shared by Romania, as the Yugoslavians had annexed Bulgaria into their state, threatening Dobruja to be claimed by them. Romania and the Mede de Morse would deepen their alliance, with increased trade between the two powers. With the divide of Poland and Germany, Czechoslovakia was caught in the middle. Their natural course would be to align with Poland. However, the influence that Germany holds over the country is immense, so much so that they would attempt to become neutral as to avoid any backlash from either party. In order to pressure these nations that refused to join the European Union, the German Republic had announced the foundations of the German People's Associations, Deutscher Volksbund. These associations would be established in countries that housed significant German minorities, like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, the Intermarium, Baltic countries, and Russia. While on paper, these associations would have no purpose beyond protecting German minorities within Europe from oppression in their homes, in reality, it would operate as a tool for the Germans to ensure that these states would remain under their influence, using the local populations as organized pressure groups against any anti-German stance. States that had already joined the European Union would accept the directive and aid in the foundation of these institutions. However, the eastern states would recognize the true motives of the Volksbunds. Poland and Romania would both refuse the establishment of Volksbunds in their states, but Czechoslovakia would agree. This is due to the large German minority in Czechia. This way, the Czechoslovaks would keep their territorial integrity and maintain some level of neutrality. After the distancing of the Intermarium and Romania, and natural distancing of Turkey and their Sadabat Pact, the remaining Saxon allies had to form a new alliance to suit the new political situation. Germany, Britain, Northern France, Northern Italy, the nations in the Benelux and Scandinavia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Russia would found the Association of Democratic Nations in 1949. Regardless of the defiance of Poland and Romania, the Germans were still incredibly prosperous, thanks to their economic union, sure, but also due to their close ally of the Russian Empire. Russia has been liberated from Bolshevism. Their people are free, but they are destitute. The official narrative is that it's a natural consequence of communism and is temporary. However, the assets of prior Soviet corporations are now in the hands of German investors without much sign of a middle or upper class having room to develop in Russia. The Volksbund system was expanded to a greater extent in Russia under the Germans' reconstruction efforts. This is due to the treatment that Stalin had given their local Germans after they had gone to war. Stalin exported many Germans to labor camps in Siberia. Some would still remain in Siberia under the Soviet successor government, but these Siberian Germans are specifically being allowed to resettle, and by doing so, strengthening German influence in Russia. Germany would oversee the reintroductions of the Volga Germans back into their homes, and ensure that the new Russian government would provide significant autonomy to the Germans there and the rest of the country. With German dominance over Russian resources and industry, extreme political influence, and heavy influence on the local German populations, Russia in its current state is a Reichskommissariat, all but in name. But you know, it's not imperialism because they're like liberal, right? Well, not exactly. The Russian constitution was liberal and had many liberal parties, but Russia's politics would be dominated by one man in one party. Vlasov and his Russian People's Party. Vlasov would become the first elected prime minister of Russia, solidifying his grasp of the country. He would perform some socialist-leaning reforms, often leading far into what most would consider communistic. However, it was all in efforts to assert Russian independence and limit German influence in their state. Another example of Vlasov's attempts to circumvent German influence in Russia was the refusal to join the European Union. While they were invited, Vlasov had argued that the Russian economy had not recovered enough in order to properly join the Union without causing instability. He also cited German apprehension to continue hostilities against the communists of the East as reason to be concerned regarding German intentions with Russia. Vlasov would privately assure the Germans that he had the intention to join the European Union after Russia was stable and unified, but never made any promises in writing as to keep his options open. With these political moves, Germany began to distrust Vlasov and would attempt to improve the democracy of Russia with further constitutional amendments in support of other pro-German parties. Regardless of the attempts to mitigate and increase influence, there was no doubt that the Germans were here to stay for a long time, as any animosity the Russians may hold for their German puppet masters was much less than they had for their foes in the East. After the communists had managed to liberate East Asia from Japanese imperialism and withhold the German advance into Siberia, the war-exhausted Germans had signed a peace with the communists of the East, recognizing the Siberian Soviet Republic. After this, there was no debate regarding who was in control. The Chinese communists under Mao Zedong were finally able to bring peace to the proletariat of Asia. However, there was still much instability for the communist movements of the East. Firstly, while China was united under one party, the CCP, lands that it had claimed were still not in their influence. America had supported the CCP in their struggle against Japan, but the support ended there. The island of Taiwan continued to be occupied by America, with no promises of unity with the mainland. The lack of authority in many regions like the western provinces had led to Uyghur separatists supported by the Germans. Secondly, the Siberian Soviet Republic had no cemented leadership. These were several prominent figures from local politics, and some remaining old USSR leaders, but due to the political instability, were not able to solidify their regime, and thus were heavily dependent on Mao Zedong for stability. It was clear to Mao that Chinese communism needed to adapt, and thus would take a radically different approach than in our history. In this timeline, Mao Zedong would not proclaim the People's Republic of China. Instead, he would, with the consent of the Siberian, Korean, and Mongolian communist states, create the UESR, United Eurasian Socialist Republics. The Sino-Soviet Union would claim an unprecedented amount of land. Every claim of China's, on top of all the Soviet Union's former territories, as a true successor to their legacy. With support of all the peoples under their protection, they sought to rapidly industrialize with the aid of Russian experience and Siberian resources, to fulfill the ambition of Stalin and spread the revolution to the world. The UESR began heavily investing in communist movements like northern Japan, and supporting anti-colonial revolutionaries in Cato and ADN-aligned nations alike, seeking to significantly improve their position and potentially expand their union. While the ADN would not face the initial wave of anti-colonial unrest, Cato members were forced to dig in and fortify their positions in order to contain the Red Menace. The Philippines, Formosa, and Japan would be under the general administration of Douglas MacArthur. Since Japan is such a vital strategic location in order to contain the UESR from expanding their influence into the Pacific, the military presence in Japan would be much more significant, and the article forcing their demilitarization would not be enforced in this timeline. Instead, the USA would invest heavily into rehabilitating the Japanese army in order to destroy the North Japanese Republic. Formosa would be occupied by America as they contemplated their fate. They could either prop up a puppet regime to destabilize the mainland, or attempt to divorce Formosa from its Chinese past. Regardless, it would remain a heavily militarized island in hopes to best contain the UESR. Vietnam would be transferred back to its rightful owners of southern France, but would suffer an intense guerrilla campaign in the region. However, with America's extreme disdain for communism in this timeline, they would irrationally reinforce the region constantly in attempts to maintain their incomplete blockade. This would only increase tensions with the UESR, as America seeks to bait them into engaging in conflict. This containment policy would spread to Burma, India, and the Himalayas. India would be one of Cato's greatest assets, a recently freed state which is English-speaking and brimming with population. The Americans would fund their state heavily, leading to an earlier Indian industrialization. However, because India contains the entire peninsula under their reign, there are many insurgents seeking to establish states of their own, most prominently Pakistan, who would be continuously supported by the Germans and Turkish as a means of weakening their adversaries of Cato. However, this policy may be to their detriment, as weakening India may give way to a communist revolution in solidarity with the UESR. However, Asia is not the only place Cato has to fear rebellions in, as the ADN begin decolonization efforts. Seeking to cause instability in Cato-aligned colonies, the ADN began decolonization in their colonies. The German League of Nations mandates would expire along with the League itself, leading to an independent Cameroon and Togoland. both with Deutscher Volksbund to protect the settler Germans, of course. Following German lead, the British and Northern French began to decolonize as well. However, the decolonization process would not be nearly as straightforward. Administrators of northern French colonies bordering southern French colonies would defect in exchange for keeping their positions. These territories would soon suffer violent revolutions, causing chaos in Western Africa, fearing decolonization destroying the apartheid regime. South Africa and Rhodesia would recognize the Edwardian government as their true rulers. Them and the exiled Portuguese would soon face anti-colonial revolts as the entire southern cone of Africa becomes a war zone. Even the ADN takes significantly controversial measures by deploying troops in Namibia. The northern coast of Africa remains relatively more stable in comparison. However, significant anti-colonial movements are still present. Egyptian rebels are being supported by the ADN. What seems to be a wise move may end up causing significant instability in the Middle East. Turkey had managed to survive the intense invasion of the Soviet Union and succeeded in Operation Alexander with the support of the Saxon Allies. However, at the end of the war, Turkey had once again turned inwards. Turkey had attempted to transform the Satabad Pact into a greater faction, seeking to protect the newly independent Central Asian nations and function as a neutral bloc, benefiting from the influence of both the ADN and Cato. However, this measure would be mostly misguided, as their allies were far too unstable for Turkey to remain on the sidelines of the conflict. Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan had all only recently recovered from the southern thrust. These countries would be subject to a proxy war that would determine Turkey's alignment, as the USA began supporting a Republican movement in Iran through their connection to India in response to the ADN supporting Pakistani separatism. The ideal of a united Arabia was pursued by the ADN in order to disrupt Cato's attempts of setting up a sphere of influence among the states in the region. The ADN's preferred candidate for unification was Iraq, but they lacked any significant popular support. Meanwhile, the Ba'athist movement was gaining significant traction. Egyptian insurgents were prominently Ba'athists under Nasser, who sought to create a united socialist Arabia. Another reason why the Latin Axis would not support a united Arab movement is that they were Zionists and sought the establishment of Israel as a state, but far beyond the boundaries initially conceived by Zionists. Revisionist Zionists sought to create their state in the regions of Palestine and Jordan, promising autonomy to the locals. However, with the revisionist Zionist movement being established and without much forethought and care, the potential for a Jewish state is threatened by the political maneuvering of the ADN. While the Middle East was not in open conflict yet, the stage had been set for insurgencies. Cato had begun to foment a civil war in a nation critical to the ADN's geopolitical position, Greece. The Greek state had managed to survive the onslaught of the Second World War. They would gain land in Albania and unite with Cyprus, but the expected concession of Rhodes was instead given to Turkey. While the Greek government would not express disdain publicly, the Greek populace had become incredibly disillusioned with the Saxon Allies. As usual, there was a debate regarding the political structure of Greece: monarchy or republic. The monarchy had lasted throughout the war, and Metaxas politics had managed to keep the region stable, but it had the adverse effect of flaring up Greek nationalism to the detriment of the status quo. To many Greeks, it seemed to be that the monarchy was only in place to allow for ADN influence to fester. This nationalistic movement would sway many different political groups under their banner. Inspired by the Dino Grande form of democratic fascism, fascistic parties would unite with Republican liberals against the monarchists. This sudden political shift had led to a civil war breaking out between pro-German monarchists and pro-American Republicans. Greece's position in the Mediterranean was incredibly vital for both the Germans and Americans, as if Cato were to succeed and hypothetically invade Turkey, the newly found access to the Black Sea would allow for the non-belligerent Romanians and Polish to potentially join Cato and crumble the German order. Thus, the first proxy war of the Cold War would begin, but not without responses from the ADN and Comintern alike. Due to the Venezuelans joining the Latin Axis, they were able to expand their influence greatly. However, it only encouraged the reactionary, anti-democratic factions to act earlier than in our timeline. Soon after declaring war, the military would perform a coup in order to ensure the security of the war effort. After the war had ended, they decided to keep these dictatorial powers. In response, liberals began agitating and soon began revolting. These revolts would be directly supported by the ADN as they began their attempts to gain a foothold in America. Seeing the Americans' potential weakness, the North Japanese communists would begin an invasion of southern Japan, in a war that mirrors our Korean War. Douglas MacArthur would do his best to secure all of Japan for Kato, threatening nuclear strikes if the UESR had intervened. This sounds ludicrous. However, in our history, Douglas MacArthur had requested 34 nuclear strikes along the North Korean PRC border in order to ensure their victory in the Korean War. In our history, Truman would dismiss MacArthur. However, in this timeline, the fascist sympathetic Lindbergh would be president. The potential of America to seriously consider nuclear strikes in this conflict is extremely plausible. With the potential of nuclear war on the horizon, how would the ADN react? Would they continue the Russian reclamation against the UASR? Or would they attempt to keep tensions low in hopes to avoid an escalation towards a Third World War? Who would win the proxy wars spreading across the globe? These questions would be answered in Project Stresa Season 2. Talons in Twilight. Revisiting Project Stresa after a break made me realize truly how much of a potential there is for a Project Stresa Cold War. However, with a point of divergence as far back as 1919, it's extremely difficult to speculate in such a rich period of history. So it may be a while before this story is expanded, if at all. However, I would love to hear what you all think about Talons in Twilight. So please leave comments and consider joining my Discord where we can discuss further. While I may not be able to speculate, I did come up with an interesting way to expand on Project Stresa. If you join my Discord and navigate to the announcements channel, you'll see an invite to a Nation Roleplay Discord server for Talons in Twilight. Join the Discord and sign up to play as one of the nations in this Cold War scenario and expand on the fate of the Project Stresa timeline with the community. Who knows, maybe I'll make a video about what you all make. Thanks again for watching Project Stresa. I hope you've all enjoyed. Please consider sharing with your friends, liking the video, and subscribing if you want to see my next series, Project Bourbon. I hope you all have a good day.